Okay, so we are diving into something today that is just deeply, deeply relatable, and honestly, a bit agonizing. It's this paradox. Knowing a situation, maybe a relationship, maybe a work dynamic, is fundamentally wrong, but you stay anyway, right? We have all seen it. Honestly, a lot of us have lived it. You see the red flags, you analyze them perfectly, you know exactly what's going on, yet your feet stay firmly planted. Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking a fascinating psychological framework from identity epistemology that gets into exactly why this happens, and more importantly, how we can finally break free from it.
So why do highly perceptive, highly intelligent people stay in damaging situations? It's a really painful question, isn't it? Society usually hits us with this narrative that if someone stays in a toxic spot, they must just be naive or foolish or, missing the signs. But we're going to completely validate a totally different reality here. Staying is absolutely not a sign of ignorance. For so many incredibly smart people, it's actually the result of a profound, complex inner conflict. You aren't blind to the damage at all. Your internal wiring is just kind of putting your response to it on a massive delay.
And that brings us to this really eye-opening foundational truth. Insight alone does not prevent harm. This right here is the absolute core thesis of the identity epistemology framework we're looking at. Listen, being smart, being highly analytical, having this razor-sharp read on the people around you, it's not a magic protective shield. You can perfectly dissect someone's behavior and still be completely devastated by it at the end of the day. Because insight, without action, well, it's just silent observation.
Let's talk about the paradox of perception. What's so wild about this is that it forces us to confront how completely backwards society has it when trying to understand why smart people endure terrible relationships. We kind of naturally assume that perception and action are a package deal, right? Like a single unified mechanism. You see a fire, you run from the fire. Boom. But in complex human relationships, perception and action are actually two completely separate circuits. And for some folks, the perception circuit is working brilliantly, but the action circuit is literally shorted out. We've got to debunk this massive myth right now. People love to chalk this up to denial or blindness or just plain old poor judgment. You hear it all the time. Oh my gosh, how could they not see it? But the reality? The reality is an authority failure. It's a permissions issue. You aren't missing the signs. You see them perfectly. You literally just lack the internal permission to do anything about them.
Which brings us to the absolute core of this whole thing: perception without authority. This happens when your capacity to recognize someone's identity and their behavior completely outpaces your internalized right to actually trust and act on what you're seeing. To put it simply, you can see right through someone. You see the glaring discrepancy between their authentic self and the mask they're wearing. You've got their behavioral patterns pegged, but you override your own perception. You delay taking any action. You rationalize the whole mess. Your perception is literally flawless, but your authority to act on it is just nowhere to be found.
So you're probably wondering, how on earth does someone get wired this way? Well, we have to go down to the ground floor. Childhood origins. It prompts a really vital question. How does a person develop this incredible perceptual acuity, literally a superpower for reading a room, alongside such critically low self-loyalty? It definitely doesn't happen by accident. Actually, it's a highly specific adaptive survival mechanism that gets installed really early in life.
And this is a process. It builds through a very specific survival sequence. First up, you've got early pattern recognition. A lot of the time, these folks had to learn how to read the emotional weather of a room before they could even walk. Second, reading others for safety. If your environment was unpredictable, accurately predicting the moods of the adults around you wasn't just a party trick, it was a vital survival skill. Third, conditional attachment. Basically, love and safety had to be earned by adapting to others, not by asserting yourself. And finally, the psyche learns this utterly devastating lesson. Seeing is allowed, acting is dangerous. Your childhood adaptation rewarded you for understanding others, not for protecting yourself. You got praise for being so understanding, right? Never for setting boundaries.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates why highly perceptive people are so incredibly vulnerable in adulthood. It's because they understand exactly why someone is misaligned. They look at a toxic partner or a friend, and they see the childhood origins of that person's mask. So they constantly contextualize the harmful behavior. They think, oh, they're only lashing out because they're hurting deep down. And here is the absolute tragedy of it all. Insight substitutes for boundaries. Empathy and explanation become this tragic delay mechanism. You swap out your authority for hope. The more accurately you can perceive someone else's pain, the longer you end up tolerating their toxic behavior.
Okay,
Now we're stepping into the deepest, most vulnerable emotional layer of this whole framework, the attachment trap. Why in the world do we prioritize connection over self-protection, even when we explicitly know we're being harmed? Well, it's because human connection isn't just a nice-to-have luxury. It is a biological and psychological imperative. When our early access to connection was inconsistent or heavily conditional, our nervous system actually learned to panic at the mere thought of being alone.
Which leads right into a massive behavioral trap: attachment-driven authority suppression. This is what's happening when you silence or delay taking self-protective action, specifically because you are terrified of losing the connection. You are actively prioritizing having someone over being aligned. Now, it's really important to note, your personal authority isn't actually gone. It's just being purposefully muted by your own nervous system. Your brain has falsely learned that any connection, even a genuinely terrible one, is safer than no connection at all.
Being seen poorly is better than not being seen at all. Wow. That perfectly captures the internalized loop keeping people trapped in these relational dead zones. We literally reframe harm as something we can tolerate just to avoid the existential threat of loneliness. We excuse repeated boundary violations, we overgive, and we confuse familiarity with actual safety. And all of this happens because that loop is constantly running in the background, suppressing our authority to just get up and leave. But we have to get real for a second and look at the sober reality of what happens when we stay stuck in this loop: the cost of inaction. Enduring this pattern isn't just an innocent waiting game. It causes severe, long-term psychological and relational damage. Think of it this way. Every single time you perceive a truth but refuse to act on it, you are basically taking a hammer to your own internal piggy bank and making a huge withdrawal from your self-trust.
And the consequences? They are stark. You remain in mismatched partnerships way past their expiration date. You end up trusting a person's claimed identity over their actually demonstrated identity, which just leads to chronic emotional erosion. But the most tragic observation of all this is the deep erosion of your own self-trust. You aren't missing the red flags. You are literally outliving your own alarm system. It's like living in a house with a blaring smoke detector. Eventually, you just go completely deaf to the alarm.
Now, when people finally do leave these situations, they're often hit out of nowhere with this massive wave of delayed sadness and confusion. They torture themselves asking, why didn't I act when I knew? What is wrong with me? But I want to offer you an incredibly powerful reframe right here. Grief that appears later is not weakness. It is authority arriving after the fact. Seriously. That grief and that mistaken self-blame, it's actually a really positive sign. It is just the delayed arrival of your personal authority finally catching up to the perception you had all along. Okay, so how do we fix this? How do we reclaim our identity authority? How do we take that absolutely flawless perception of yours and finally bolt an engine to it so it can drive you to safety? Well, it requires a fundamental shift in how you view connection, self-abandonment, and, yes, solitude. The resolution for this is called identity-authority alignment. This happens when perception and permission finally beautifully unify. Perception actually becomes actionable truth. And crucially, this is the big one, self-protection is no longer framed in your mind as an abandonment of others. Alignment resolves when your fear of being alone loses its grip and its dominance over your nervous system. That's when connection becomes something you consciously choose rather than a life raft you're clinging to out of sheer survival. Let's just take a breath and let this critical doctrine statement land because it is heavy and it is important. Seeing is sufficient grounds for action. Let me repeat that. Seeing is sufficient grounds for action. You do not need a confession from the other person. You don't need them to agree with your assessment of the situation. You definitely don't need absolute objective proof vetted by a jury of your peers. If you clearly see the misalignment, that vision alone gives you the full, unbridled authority to act and to protect yourself. And this leads us to a really crucial ethical boundary. Understanding does not obligate endurance. Empathy does not cancel authority. Just because you know why someone is acting toxic does not mean you are required to stay there and endure it. Without these core ethical stances, doing identity work or psychological deep dives really risks becoming an explanatory prison instead of a tool for your liberation. Empathy is a wonderful gift, absolutely, but it should never, ever be your jailer.
Now, if you've been recognizing yourself in this explainer today, I want to offer you one final, gentle internal guardrail. This whole thing, it's not a flaw to correct. It is simply a phase to outgrow. Look, if you restore your authority and you bravely step away from a bad dynamic, you might feel a brief wave of intense loneliness. I need you to know that loneliness is not regression. It is simply you clearing space for real connection and restoring your own identity sovereignty. Because once authority aligns with perception, my friends, the pattern stops repeating. Your tolerance for self-betrayal will just collapse, pretty much overnight.
To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. If connection without integrity isn't really connection at all, but merely containment, I have to ask you, take a look at your own relationships right now. Are you currently connected, or are you simply contained? Take that thought with you today. Reflect on your own alignment. And please remember, your perception is a brilliant gift, and it fully deserves the authority to act.